She was 17 years old when they buried her alive. Not in the ground, no. Something far worse. They buried her in silence. In shame. In the kind of darkness that doesn't need dirt to suffocate you. And for 46 years, Dawn Momohara stayed in that grave, breathing but not living, existing but not surviving. Until one morning in 2023, she woke up and decided that the people who put her there would finally learn what it feels like to choke on their own secrets. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you're watching this right now, I need you to understand something. This story will make you uncomfortable. It will make you angry. And by the end, it might just change the way you see the quiet people around you. The ones who smile but never quite meet your eyes. The ones whose hands shake when someone raises their voice. Before we go any further, if stories like this matter to you, if you believe that truth deserves to be heard, I need you to do something right now. Share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Because Dawn's story almost died with her, and the only reason it didn't is because someone finally decided to listen. Don't let her silence be for nothing. Now, let me take you back to a small fishing town on the coast of Oregon called Millbrook Harbor. Population in 1977, just under 4,000 souls. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, your parents' names, and exactly how much money your family didn't have. The kind of place where appearances weren't just important, they were everything. Dawn Momohara was born in 1960, the second daughter of Henry and Sachiko Momohara. Her father was a third-generation Japanese-American fisherman whose family had survived the internment camps of World War II and rebuilt their lives from nothing. Her mother was a seamstress who had immigrated from Nagasaki in 1952, carrying with her the invisible weight of what she'd witnessed as a child, weight she never spoke about, not once, not ever. The Momoharas were what people in Millbrook called respectable. They kept their small house immaculate. They attended church every Sunday. They bowed their heads and said thank you and never, ever caused trouble. Dawn learned early that this was the price of belonging. Keep quiet. Keep clean. Keep invisible. But Dawn was not invisible. Not really. She was beautiful in a way that made people uncomfortable, the kind of beautiful that felt like an accusation. Long black hair that fell past her waist. Eyes that her mother said held too much, saw too much. A mind that asked questions when questions weren't welcome. By 17, Dawn had learned to shrink herself, to speak softer, to walk smaller, to pretend she didn't notice when the boys at school whispered about her in the hallways, or when their fathers lingered too long at the fish market, staring at her while she helped her father wrap salmon in paper. She had learned that being noticed was dangerous, that attention was a currency she couldn't afford. But there was one place where Dawn allowed herself to be big. One place where she didn't apologize for existing. The lighthouse. It stood at the edge of Millbrook Harbor, a white sentinel that had guided ships home for over 100 years. Most people thought it was abandoned, and technically, it was. The Coast Guard had automated the light in 1968. But Dawn had discovered something that no one else knew. The lighthouse keeper's quarters were still intact. Dusty and forgotten, filled with old books and maritime charts and a small piano that was missing 3 keys. And every Sunday afternoon, while the town attended church services that the Momoharas were permitted to attend but never truly welcomed at, Dawn would slip away to her lighthouse. She would play that broken piano. She would read those old books. She would stand at the top of the spiral staircase and look out at the endless gray ocean and imagine a life beyond Millbrook Harbor. A life where she could be loud, where she could take up space, where she could be Dawn Momohara without apology. It was at the lighthouse that she met him. Thomas Whitmore III. Tommy, as everyone called him, was the crown prince of Millbrook Harbor. His grandfather had founded the town's only bank. His father was the mayor. His mother hosted garden parties that everyone attended and no one enjoyed. Tommy was golden in a way that made people want to orbit him, handsome and charming and so comfortable in his own skin that it seemed almost cruel. He found Dawn at the lighthouse on a Sunday in March of 1977. She didn't hear him coming. She was playing the broken piano, a melody she'd made up herself, something sad and strange and beautiful. When she turned and saw him standing in the doorway, she felt something she'd never felt before, seen. "You play beautifully," he said. And the way he said it made her believe him. I know what you're thinking. You've heard this story before. The rich boy and the poor girl. The forbidden romance. The inevitable heartbreak. But this is not that story. This is something far darker. Something that would shatter Dawn Momohara into pieces so small that she would spend decades trying to find them all. Their friendship was secret, of course. It had to be. Tommy's family would never approve of him spending time with a Japanese girl from the wrong side of town, and Dawn's parents would never understand why she was risking everything for a boy who could never truly be hers. But for 3 months, from March to June of 1977, they met at the lighthouse every Sunday. He brought her books from the library his mother funded. She taught him to play the broken piano. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about dreams and fears, and the crushing weight of expectation. And slowly, carefully, Dawn began to trust him. That was her first mistake. Love, when you've never known it, feels like a revelation. That's what Dawn would tell me, decades later, when she finally found the words. She said that before Tommy, she had understood love only as a theory. Her parents loved each other, she supposed, but their love was practical, a partnership forged in survival. They didn't touch in front of their daughters. They didn't speak tender words. Love, in the Momohara household, was demonstrated through silence, through sacrifice, through the food on the table and the roof overhead. But Tommy made her feel something different. He looked at her like she was interesting, like her thoughts mattered, like she wasn't just a ghost haunting the edges of a town that tolerated her existence. By April of 1977, Dawn was falling in love. She knew it was dangerous. She knew it was foolish. But for the first time in her life, she felt alive in a way that terrified her. And so she kept going to the lighthouse, kept meeting him in secret, kept building a castle out of moments that could never last. Tommy told her about the pressure he felt, the weight of being a Whitmore. His father expected him to take over the bank. His mother expected him to marry the right girl, someone from the Peterson family or the Clarks, someone with the right pedigree and the right skin and the right last name. He said he hated it, said he wanted to run away, to become a writer, to live somewhere where no one knew his family's name. Dawn believed every word. She told him things she'd never told anyone. About her grandmother, her mother's mother, who had died in Nagasaki in 1945. About the way her mother sometimes sat alone in the kitchen at night, staring at nothing, tears streaming down her face. About how Dawn felt caught between two worlds, American and Japanese, belonging fully to neither. Tommy listened. He held her hand. He told her she was the most extraordinary person he'd ever met. And then, on a Sunday in late May, he kissed her. It happened at the top of the lighthouse, the sun setting over the ocean, painting everything gold and rose. Dawn had never been kissed before. She didn't know what to do with her hands, her lips, her racing heart. But Tommy was patient, gentle. He told her she was beautiful, told her he was falling in love with her. Dawn went home that night and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. She barely recognized the girl staring back at her. This girl had color in her cheeks, light in her eyes, hope, actual hope, for the first time in her life. She should have known it wouldn't last. The first crack appeared in early June. Tommy missed a Sunday. He sent a note through a friend, apologizing, saying his father had required his presence at a family event. Dawn understood. Of course she understood. But something in her chest tightened, a small cold fear that she tried to ignore. The next Sunday, he came, but he was different, distracted. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear. When Dawn asked what was wrong, he smiled and said nothing. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. By the third Sunday in June, the truth came out. His parents had arranged a courtship. Elizabeth Clark, the only daughter of the town's most prominent physician. They'd known each other since childhood. Their families had always expected them to marry. Tommy said it meant nothing. Said Elizabeth was boring, vapid, nothing like Dawn. He said he would find a way out of it. But Dawn saw the truth in his eyes. She saw the resignation, the acceptance. She saw a boy who had been playing pretend, dreaming of a life he would never actually choose. I want you to pause here. I want you to think about something. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to realize they were never who you thought they were? Have you ever given someone the power to destroy you? Not because you were weak, but because you were hopeful? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Dawn should have walked away then. She knew it. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. But love makes you stupid. Hope makes you blind. And Dawn was 17 years old, desperate for something beautiful in a life that had given her so little. So when Tommy took her hand and promised that he would fix everything, she believed him. That was her second mistake. On June 24, 1977, Tommy invited Dawn to a party. A real party at the Whitmore estate. He said he wanted to introduce her to his world. He said it was time to stop hiding. Dawn knew it was reckless, knew it was dangerous. But the thought of being seen, of being acknowledged, of stepping out of the shadows even for a moment, it was intoxicating. She didn't tell her parents. She borrowed a dress from her sister's closet, a simple blue thing that her sister had worn to a school dance years ago. She walked 3 miles to the Whitmore estate, heart pounding, palms sweating, feeling more alive and more terrified than she'd ever felt. The house was enormous. White columns, manicured gardens, cars lining the circular driveway, shining and expensive. Dawn could hear music and laughter spilling from the open windows. She almost turned around and left right there. But then she saw Tommy waiting at the side door, just like he'd promised, and his smile made her forget her fear. He led her through the servants' entrance, up a back staircase, to a small sitting room on the second floor. There were others there, 4 of Tommy's friends, all of them from the best families in town. They looked at Dawn with curiosity, with something else she couldn't quite name. Tommy handed her a drink. Punch, he said. Dawn had never tasted alcohol before, but she was too nervous to ask. She sipped it slowly as the others talked about people she didn't know and places she'd never been. Tommy kept refilling her glass, kept telling her to relax. By the time Dawn realized something was wrong, it was too late. The room was spinning. Her legs wouldn't work properly. She tried to stand, tried to speak, but the words came out slurred and strange. She saw Tommy's face, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. The mask was gone. In its place was something cold, something predatory. The last thing she remembered, before the darkness took her, was Tommy's voice. I told you she'd be easy. I didn't remember everything at first. That's how Dawn described it to me. She said the memories came back in pieces. Fragments. Shards of glass that cut her every time she tried to hold them. She remembered waking up. The room was different, darker, smaller. She was on a floor, cold tile pressing against her cheek. Her dress was torn. There was pain in places she didn't want to think about. And there was blood. She remembered crawling, pulling herself across the floor to a door that wouldn't open, screaming until her throat was raw, pounding on the wood until her fists bled. She remembered silence. And then, hours later, she remembered light. The door opened. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the brightness. For one delirious moment, Dawn thought she was being rescued. But it wasn't a rescuer. It was Eleanor Whitmore, Tommy's mother. Eleanor looked at Dawn the way one might look at a stain on an expensive carpet. With disgust. With annoyance. With the cold calculation of someone assessing a problem to be solved. Get up, Eleanor said. Not a question. A command. Dawn couldn't get up. Her body wouldn't obey. So Eleanor called for someone, a man Dawn didn't recognize, and they lifted her, not gently, and carried her down a back staircase, out a service door, and deposited her in the back seat of a dark car. Dawn didn't know where they were taking her. She was too broken to care. She drifted in and out of consciousness as the car wound through unfamiliar roads. When they finally stopped, it was morning. Gray light filtered through the windows. They were at a building she'd never seen. A cold institutional structure surrounded by wire fencing. Brightwater Psychiatric Hospital. Dawn would spend the next 6 months of her life there. The official story, the one Eleanor Whitmore had crafted with the precision of a surgeon, was simple. Dawn Momohara, disturbed teenage girl, had shown up at the Whitmore estate uninvited. She had made wild accusations against young Tommy. She had become hysterical, violent even. She was clearly mentally unwell. Fortunately, the Whitmore family, compassionate as always, had arranged for her to receive the help she so desperately needed. Dawn's parents were given this story by Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician who owed his practice to loans from the Whitmore Bank. They were told that their daughter had suffered a psychotic break, that she was a danger to herself and others, that if they truly loved her, they would let the doctors help. Henry and Sachiko Momohara had spent their entire lives being told to trust authorities, to not make trouble, to believe that the system, the American system they had worked so hard to belong to, would treat them fairly. They signed the commitment papers. And just like that, Dawn Momohara ceased to exist. Inside Brightwater, Dawn learned what it meant to have no voice. When she told the nurses what had happened, they wrote it down as delusion. When she begged to see her parents, they gave her pills that made her mind foggy and her tongue thick. When she refused to take the pills, they held her down and injected her with something that made the world go away for days at a time. The doctors told her that her memories were false, that she had invented the assault because she was obsessed with Tommy Whitmore, that her mind was sick, broken, unreliable. They told her this so many times, in so many ways, that she began to wonder if they were right. Maybe she was crazy. Maybe she had imagined everything. Maybe she was exactly what they said she was, a disturbed girl who needed to be fixed. By the time Dawn was released in January of 1978, she barely recognized herself. The girl who had dreamed of a life beyond Millbrook Harbor was gone. In her place was someone smaller, quieter, someone who had learned the hardest lesson of all. Nobody was coming to save her. Her parents picked her up from Brightwater in silence. They didn't ask what had happened. They didn't mention the Whitmores or the hospital or anything that had occurred in 1977. It was as if those months had been erased from history, as if Dawn's suffering had never happened. And in a way, it hadn't. Because in Millbrook Harbor, the truth was whatever the Whitmores decided it was. And the Whitmores had decided that Dawn Momohara was a liar, a troubled girl who had tried to ruin their son's reputation and had been dealt with accordingly. Dawn returned to a town that looked at her with suspicion and pity. She finished high school by correspondence, too ashamed to return to classes. She worked at her father's fish market, gutting salmon and keeping her eyes down. She didn't play the piano anymore. She didn't go to the lighthouse. She didn't dream. She simply survived. Years passed. The world moved on. Dawn did not. In 1982, she left Millbrook Harbor. Not dramatically, not with any proclamation of escape. She simply got on a bus one morning and didn't come back. Her parents received a postcard a month later. Portland. She'd found a job at a laundry. She was fine. Fine. That word would define Dawn's existence for the next 3 decades. She moved from city to city, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Sacramento. She worked jobs that kept her invisible, laundries and cleaning services and back-of-house restaurant work. She rented rooms in houses full of strangers. She didn't make friends. She didn't date. She didn't allow anyone close enough to hurt her again. Every night, she had the same dream. The lighthouse. Tommy's smile. The darkness closing in. She would wake up gasping, clawing at sheets, and then she would lie in the dark until dawn, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she would ever feel anything again. She thought about ending it, more times than she wanted to admit. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret that heavy, from knowing that you're not crazy, that what happened to you was real, but having no way to prove it, no one to believe you, no path to justice. The only thing that kept Dawn alive during those darkest years was spite. She wanted to outlive them. Eleanor Whitmore, Tommy, Dr. Webb, all the people who had looked at her broken body and decided she was the problem. She wanted to live long enough to see them die, even if she had to watch from a distance, even if she never got her revenge. It was a small thing, spite, but sometimes small things are enough. In 1995, Dawn's mother died. Cancer. Dawn went back to Millbrook Harbor for the funeral. It was the first time she'd seen the town in 13 years. Everything looked smaller, grayer. The lighthouse was still there, still standing, now a historical landmark with tours on weekends. Dawn stood at her mother's grave and felt nothing. That terrified her more than the sadness would have. Her father was dying too, though he wouldn't admit it. His heart was giving out. He had maybe a year, the doctors said. Dawn stayed with him through his final months, cooking and cleaning and pretending that they were a normal family, that nothing had ever happened, that she was still the daughter he thought he knew. One night, a week before he died, Henry Momohara did something unexpected. He asked Dawn to sit with him. He took her hand, his grip weak but insistent. And he said 4 words that shattered 40 years of silence. "I believe you. Always." Dawn couldn't speak, couldn't move. She stared at her father's weathered face, at the tears tracking down his cheeks, and something inside her cracked open. He told her everything. He said he'd known, from the moment he signed those papers, that he was betraying his daughter. He said he was a coward. He said his fear of the Whitmores, of the system, of losing everything they'd built, had made him complicit in her destruction. He said he'd spent every day since then hating himself. He begged for forgiveness. Dawn didn't know if she had forgiveness to give, but she held his hand as he died, and when they buried him next to her mother, she made a promise. Someday, she would tell the truth. Someday, she would make them pay. She just didn't know how. For the next 28 years, Dawn continued to survive. She settled in Sacramento, working as a housekeeper at a hotel. She was invisible, the way she'd always been. But something had changed. Her father's confession had planted a seed. A tiny, stubborn seed of hope. In 2015, everything changed. A young journalist named Maya Chen checked into the hotel where Dawn worked. Maya was writing a story about historical injustices in small Oregon towns. She was researching the involuntary commitment of women to psychiatric hospitals in the 1960s and 1970s, the way families and communities had used these institutions to silence inconvenient voices. Dawn overheard Maya talking to a colleague in the hallway. She heard words like cover-up and buried records and survivors. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Dawn found herself knocking on Maya's door. It took 3 hours for Dawn to tell her story. 3 hours of stopping and starting, of tears and silence, of searching for words that had been locked away for 4 decades. Maya listened without interrupting, without judgment, without telling Dawn that she was crazy. When Dawn finished, Maya asked one question. "Do you want people to know what happened to you?" Dawn thought about it for a long time. About the shame she'd carried. About the fear. About Tommy Whitmore, who was now a U.S. Congressman representing Oregon's 2nd District. About Eleanor Whitmore, 91 years old and still presiding over Millbrook Harbor's social scene. And Dawn Momohara, 63 years old and tired of being invisible, said yes. The investigation took 8 years. 8 years of Maya Chun digging through sealed records. 8 years of tracking down witnesses and piecing together timelines. 8 years of dead ends and breakthroughs, of lawyers and obstacles, of powerful people trying very hard to keep the past buried. What Maya uncovered was worse than anyone imagined. Dawn wasn't the only one. Between 1965 and 1982, 12 young women had been committed to Brightwater Psychiatric Hospital under suspicious circumstances. All of them came from working class or immigrant families. All of them had connections, however tenuous, to prominent families in Millbrook Harbor. And all of them had the same story: accusations of hysteria, delusion, or moral degeneracy that conveniently silenced whatever truth they might have told. The pattern was unmistakable. Brightwater was where inconvenient girls went to disappear. Maya found 7 of the 12 women still alive. She interviewed each of them. Their stories were different in the details, but identical in the structure. They had seen something, said something, or done something that threatened someone powerful, and they had paid for it with their freedom and their sanity. One woman, Maria Gonzalez, had accused a local businessman of stealing from his workers. Another, Patricia O'Brien, had reported that her employer was embezzling from the town treasury. A third, Sandra Blackwood, had complained that a prominent doctor had prescribed her medication that made her sick on purpose. And Dawn Momohara had accused Thomas Whitmore III of rape. Maya compiled her evidence into a series of articles that would eventually become a book. But before any of it could be published, Tommy Whitmore caught wind of the investigation. That was when the real war began. Dawn received her first threat in June of 2022. A letter, hand-delivered to her apartment, with no return address. It contained no words. Just a photograph of Dawn's sister, now 70 years old, living in a nursing home in Portland. The message was clear. But Dawn was not 17 anymore. She was not powerless. And she was no longer afraid. She contacted Maya. She contacted a lawyer. She contacted every journalist and activist she could find who might be interested in taking down a sitting congressman. And then she did something she had never done before. She went public. Her first interview was a podcast, small but growing. The host asked Dawn to tell her story from the beginning. Dawn spoke for 4 hours. She told everything. The lighthouse, Tommy, the party, the darkness, Brightwater, the decades of silence. The episode was released in September of 2022. Within a week, it had been downloaded over 1 million times. Congressman Thomas Whitmore III released a statement calling Dawn's accusations baseless lies and a politically motivated smear campaign. He said he barely remembered Dawn Momohara. He said she was a troubled woman with a history of mental illness. He said exactly what his mother had said 45 years earlier. But something was different now. The world was different. People were listening in a way they hadn't before. The other women came forward. Maria and Patricia and Sandra and the rest. They told their stories too. They confirmed the pattern. They corroborated what Maya had documented. The tide was turning. In November of 2022, 3 former Brightwater employees came forward with their own testimony. They described how the hospital had falsified records at the request of prominent families, how patients had been drugged into compliance, how young women had been kept for months or years without legitimate medical justification. One of them, a nurse named Helen Porter, now 84 years old, provided the final piece of evidence. She had kept a journal. Helen Porter's journal documented every patient she had treated at Brightwater from 1970 to 1985. It contained names, dates, treatments, and her own observations. And in an entry dated June 26, 1977, she had written about a new admission. A young Japanese-American girl. Arrived overnight. Injuries consistent with assault. The family that brought her, the Whitmores, had been insistent that she receive treatment for hysteria. Helen had objected. She had been told to mind her own business if she wanted to keep her job. The girl's name was Dawn Momohara. With Helen's journal and the testimony of the other survivors, Maya Chun had enough. The story broke in January of 2023, not as a small podcast, but as a front-page investigation in one of the largest newspapers in the country. Congressman Thomas Whitmore III announced his resignation 3 days later. Resignation was not enough. Dawn had waited 46 years. She had survived hell. She had watched the people who destroyed her live their comfortable lives while she scraped and struggled and tried to find reasons to keep breathing. A resignation, a moment of political embarrassment, that was not justice. She wanted more. The statute of limitations for rape in Oregon had long expired. There would be no criminal trial, no prison sentence. But there were other avenues. Civil suits. Congressional investigations. The court of public opinion. Maya Chin's book was published in April of 2023. It was titled Buried Alive: The Brightwater Scandal and the Women Who Refused to Stay Silent. Dawn's story was the centerpiece, but the book wove together all 12 women's experiences into a damning portrait of institutional corruption and protected privilege. The book became a bestseller. It won awards. It sparked a national conversation about how society silences women, how wealth protects predators, how systems designed to help can be weaponized to harm. And then, something unexpected happened. Eleanor Whitmore, 92 years old and still formidable, agreed to an interview. The interviewer was a young journalist named David Park. He expected Eleanor to defend her son, to dismiss the accusations, to play the role she had always played. And at first, that's exactly what she did. But midway through the interview, something shifted. David asked Eleanor if she had any regrets about how she had handled the situation in 1977. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different. Smaller. Older. "I protected my son," she said. "That's what mothers do." David pressed. "Even when your son did something wrong?" And Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who had orchestrated Dawn's destruction, the woman who had maintained her family's reputation at any cost, said something no one expected. "He told me what he did. That night. He came to my room, crying. He told me everything." She confessed. On camera. To knowing that her son had committed rape, to covering it up, to arranging Dawn's commitment to Brightwater, to spending 46 years ensuring that the truth never came out. When David asked why she was admitting this now, Eleanor smiled sadly. Because I'm dying, and I don't want to meet my maker with this on my soul. The interview aired in July of 2023. Within hours, Thomas Whitmore III had been arrested. Not for rape, but for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering related to the threats made against Dawn and her sister. The trial would take another year. But for the first time in 46 years, Dawn Momohara watched the man who had destroyed her life face consequences. And she felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. Hope. The trial of Thomas Whitmore III began in September of 2024. He was 70 years old now, still handsome in that golden way, still confident, still surrounded by lawyers and money, and the kind of privilege that had protected him his entire life. But this time, it wasn't enough. Dawn was called as a witness. She hadn't wanted to testify. The thought of facing him again, of seeing that face after all these years, made her physically ill. But her lawyer, a fierce woman named Rachel Torres, convinced her. "This is your chance to be heard," Rachel said. "To say, in a court of law, what he did to you. Not to change the charges, but to put it on the record. Forever." And so Dawn Momohara, 74 years old, walked into a federal courtroom in Portland, Oregon, and faced the man who had stolen her life. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her. Like she was nothing. Like she was invisible. But Dawn was not invisible. Not anymore. She told her story again. The lighthouse. The friendship. The betrayal. The party. The darkness. Brightwater. The decades of silence. She spoke clearly, calmly, with a voice that did not waver. When she was finished, the prosecutor asked if she had anything else to say. Dawn looked at Tommy. Really looked at him. And she said words she had been waiting 46 years to speak. "You didn't break me. You tried. God knows you tried. But I'm still here. I'm still standing. And you will spend the rest of your life knowing that a girl from a fish market in a town that didn't even want her, she survived you. I am not your victim. I am your consequence." The courtroom was silent. Tommy looked away. And for the first time since 1977, Dawn Momohara felt powerful. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On October 14, 2024, they returned with their verdict. Guilty. On all counts. Thomas Whitmore III was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He would die there. Everyone knew it. His golden life, his privileged existence, it was over. And the woman he had tried to bury alive had been the one to put him in the ground. But the story doesn't end there. Because Dawn's fight had uncovered something bigger. Maya Chin's investigation, the trial, the public attention, all of it had shined a light on Brightwater Psychiatric Hospital and the dozens of families who had used it to silence inconvenient truths. A state commission was formed. Records were unsealed. Thousands of former patients, not just the 12 Maya had found, had their cases reviewed. Many were found to have been committed without legitimate cause. The state issued formal apologies. Compensation funds were established. New laws were passed to prevent such abuses in the future. Dawn Momohara's suffering had meaning. Her 46 years of silence had not been for nothing. She had broken open a system that had destroyed countless lives, and in doing so, she had given hope to people who had none. In March of 2025, Dawn Momohara returned to Millbrook Harbor. The town had changed. The fish market her father had run was now a trendy restaurant. The church where the Whitmores had been treated like royalty had been converted into a community center. And the lighthouse, her lighthouse, was exactly as she remembered it. Dawn climbed the spiral staircase one last time. Her knees protested. Her heart raced. But she made it to the top. She stood at the window where she had once watched the sunset with a boy who had never deserved her trust. But she didn't think about Tommy. She thought about the girl she had been. The girl who had dreamed of a life beyond this town. The girl who had been buried alive and had somehow found her way back to the surface. That girl was still inside her. Older now. Wiser. Scarred in ways that would never fully heal. But alive. Still alive. Dawn had something with her. A small box that had been delivered to her Sacramento apartment a month earlier. It contained a letter and a photograph. The letter was from Tommy's son, a man Dawn had never met. His name was Michael, and he was 50 years old. The letter was an apology. Michael wrote that he had grown up knowing something was wrong with his father, something dark and hidden. He had spent his life trying to understand what secrets his family was keeping. When the truth came out, he had been devastated but not surprised. He wanted Dawn to know that his father's sins were not her burden, that she deserved peace, that if there was anything he could do to make amends for what his family had taken from her, he would do it. And the photograph was of a grand piano. A gift, Michael said, for the girl who had played a broken piano in a lighthouse and dreamed of something more. Dawn wept. She wept for the girl she had been, for the decades she had lost, for the family that had never quite understood how to love her, for the system that had failed her and all the others, for the fact that it had taken so long, too long, for anyone to believe her. But she also wept with something that felt dangerously close to joy, because she had won. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but she had won. The piano was delivered to a community center in Sacramento, where Dawn now volunteered, teaching music to children from immigrant families, children who reminded her of herself at that age, quiet and invisible and full of dreams they were afraid to voice. She taught them to play. She taught them to sing. She taught them the lesson she had learned the hardest way possible. Your voice matters, even when the world tries to silence you. Even when the people in power say you're wrong, crazy, unworthy of belief. Your voice matters. And someday, if you're patient and stubborn and brave, people will hear you. Dawn Momohara turned 75 in 2035. By then, her story was taught in schools. The Brightwater scandal was a case study in sociology and law and psychology. Young activists cited her as an inspiration. Survivors of institutional abuse reached out to her, thanking her for giving them hope. She never remarried, never had children, but she had something she had thought was impossible. She had peace. On her 78th birthday, Dawn went back to the lighthouse one final time. She walked up those stairs, slower now, and she stood at the window as the sun set over the Pacific. She thought about her parents, buried in the cemetery at the edge of town. She thought about her sister, who had passed the year before, the two of them having finally reconciled. She thought about all the women of Brightwater, some of whom she'd met in person, others only through letters and calls, a sisterhood forged in suffering and survival. And she thought about the girl who had played a broken piano in this very room, dreaming of escape. "We made it," Dawn whispered to that girl. "We made it out." The sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned gold and rose, exactly as it had on that day in 1977 when everything had changed. But this time, Dawn was not afraid of the darkness that followed. She had survived it once. She could survive it again, and again, as many times as necessary. Because Dawn Momohara was not a victim. She was a survivor, a fighter, a voice that would not be silenced. And her story, finally told, would echo through the years, a lighthouse of its own, guiding others through the darkness toward shores they thought they would never reach. That is the story of Dawn Momohara. That is the story of how a girl who was buried alive clawed her way back to the surface. That is the story of patience and spite and the stubborn refusal to stay silent. And it ends the only way it could, with victory.